Imagine being told your enemy was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse, only to be captured and discover the exact opposite. In 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers were shipped across the Atlantic, not to punishment camps, but to small towns scattered across America. What they found was shocking. Women giving orders, hamburgers on plates, and freedoms they'd never dreamed of under Nazi rule. Their worldview cracked open with every meal, every conversation, every glimpse of American life. These prisoner-of-war camps became unlikely classrooms of democracy, changing not just how Germans saw America, but how they would one day rebuild their own country. This is the forgotten story of how captivity in America planted the seeds of a new Germany. Before we dive deeper, take a second to support the channel. Hit that like button, subscribe if you love uncovering hidden history, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? It helps us bring you more stories. The textbooks often skip. The spring of 1943 was the moment when Nazi Germany's dreams of dominating North Africa finally collapsed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps, once celebrated as nearly invincible, was being crushed by the combined weight of British, American, and Free French forces. Tunisia was the last stronghold, and as Allied artillery thundered across the desert, German soldiers realized their world was shrinking to a corner of sand and smoke. For months, they had fought under blistering heat, short on supplies, running on propaganda promises of a crumbling enemy. But reality had caught up. In May alone, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms. For the Germans, the war that had once promised glory now meant surrender, humiliation, and an uncertain fate. The sheer scale of that capitulation created a logistical nightmare. Imagine, 250,000 men captured in just weeks. Where could the Allies possibly house them? Britain was already bursting at the seams, its cities scarred by bombing raids, its resources stretched to breaking point. Holding prisoners in North Africa was equally impractical. Disease, scarce rations, and volatile battlefronts made it a dangerous gamble. And yet, international law, specifically the Geneva Convention, required that these men be treated with dignity, not left to starve or die in the desert. So the Allies turned to a bold, almost unthinkable solution: send them across the Atlantic. German prisoners of war would be transported directly into the heart of the United States. When news of this decision broke, American newspapers ran with sensational headlines. Small-town families opened their morning editions to find stories warning that real Nazis were coming to live practically next door. Mothers fretted about safety, farmers feared sabotage, and many ordinary citizens recoiled at the thought of enemy soldiers walking the same streets as their children. To a public still grieving Pearl Harbor and seeing sons drafted overseas, it felt dangerously close to bringing the war home. But Allied leaders argued that America had the space, the resources, and, perhaps most importantly, the relative safety to hold so many prisoners. The U-boat threat remained, but the risk was worth it. For the first time in history, enemy soldiers would be kept on American soil in such massive numbers. The men being shipped westward were not the caricatures Americans had been shown in wartime posters, snarling, goose-stepping fanatics. Many were young, drafted barely out of high school, who had never set foot outside their German villages until they were thrust into the African desert. Others were veterans hardened by campaigns stretching back to Poland and France, now broken by exhaustion. Some were loyal Nazis, but many were simply ordinary soldiers caught in the machinery of war. To the Allies, however, they were still enemy combatants, each man a potential threat until proven otherwise. What no one could predict was how captivity in America would alter not only their perception of the war, but their very understanding of society itself. The surrender at Tunisia marked more than just the end of a campaign. It was the first great fracture in Nazi propaganda. Soldiers had been told that America was weak, distracted by consumer luxuries, and incapable of serious war. Yet the speed and scale of Allied victory in North Africa told another story, one of overwhelming industrial power and coordinated strategy. For German troops, boarding transport ships under Allied guard, this was their first brush with a terrifying truth. The Reich might not be unstoppable after all. Still, the men consoled themselves with the idea that captivity would be harsh, perhaps even brutal. They had heard rumors of British cruelty, of starvation in Russian camps, and they expected nothing better from the Americans. What awaited them, however, would defy those expectations in every way. The crossing of the Atlantic was long and nerve-wracking, shadowed by the fear of submarine attacks, but the food was plentiful, the guards professional, and discipline firm but not vindictive. These were not the conditions of a people collapsing under war. They were the signs of a nation both confident and resourceful. None of the men staring at the horizon as the American coastline came into view could have imagined how profoundly their lives were about to change. For them, the desert battles were over, but the real confrontation between Nazi ideology and American reality was just beginning. For the defeated German soldiers, the journey to captivity began not with freedom lost, but with a surprising sense of uncertainty. Herded aboard massive troop ships that had once carried American soldiers into battle, the prisoners expected harsh treatment, cramped quarters, and meager rations. Instead, many found the accommodations orderly and the food astonishingly plentiful. After months of surviving on watery soups and stale bread in North Africa, the sight of real coffee, white bread, and meat shocked them. It wasn't luxury by American standards, but for these weary men it felt like stepping into another world. Even before setting foot on American soil, they were forced to ask themselves, if this is how our enemies feed their captives, how strong must they be? The Atlantic itself loomed as a dangerous crossing. German U-boats prowled those waters, sinking Allied supply ships at alarming rates. Many prisoners, ironically, feared being killed by their own navy more than by the Americans. Packed below decks, they listened nervously as escorts patrolled the convoy routes, depth charges thundering in the distance. For some, every splash of water against the hull felt like it could be the end. Yet voyage after voyage succeeded with relatively few losses, a testament to Allied control of the seas by mid-1943. The Germans began to see firsthand the logistical might of the United States, capable of moving hundreds of thousands of men across oceans with astonishing efficiency. On deck, during brief moments of fresh air, prisoners caught their first glimpses of Allied soldiers up close. What struck many was not cruelty, but casual confidence. American guards were firm, but they didn't carry themselves with the venomous hatred Nazi propaganda had promised. They joked among themselves, shared cigarettes, and treated the prisoners with a professionalism that seemed almost baffling. The contrast with what German troops had been told, that Americans were soft, lazy, racially weak, was stark. Here stood tall, well-fed men whose discipline was matched by an easy self-assurance. For many POWs, it was their first real crack in the narrative they had grown up believing. The voyage also became an unexpected introduction to American culture. Some guards played music from portable radios, the sounds of jazz and swing drifting across the sea air, alien yet irresistible to German ears accustomed to military marches. Others read American newspapers aloud, filled with debates, advertisements, and news of home front life. Prisoners listened, half in disbelief, as they heard about women working in factories, movies being released, or baseball games drawing crowds in the middle of war. This was not the picture of a nation on its knees. It was a country living, thriving, and confident enough to let its soldiers laugh and dance even in the midst of global conflict. Meals remained the most enduring memory. The simple act of being served nutritious food 3 times a day challenged everything the Germans had been told about Allied desperation. Fresh vegetables, genuine meat, and bread baked from wheat flour. These were luxuries that had vanished in Germany long before. Some men whispered among themselves, If this is how they treat prisoners, what must life be like for ordinary Americans? The irony wasn't lost. Here they were, enemy soldiers, eating better than many of their families back home. With each bite, the myth of American weakness crumbled further. By the time the ships neared the American coastline, the men's anticipation was laced with awe as much as dread. They had braced themselves for starvation or brutality, but instead had been given a preview of abundance and order. The Atlantic crossing had not been a nightmare of suffering, but a bewildering first step into a reality that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had prepared them for. As the Statue of Liberty, New York Harbor, or Norfolk's docks came into view, these young soldiers stood silent, staring at the skyline of their enemy. Few could have imagined that captivity here would not only reshape their war, but transform their very understanding of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. The train wheels clattered rhythmically against the rails, carrying thousands of captured German soldiers deep into the American heartland. For many, this was their first time seeing the United States beyond propaganda leaflets or distorted maps in Nazi classrooms. Peering out of the barred windows, they expected to glimpse a land ravaged by war, bombed cities, breadlines, and poverty. Instead, mile after mile revealed endless farmland, prosperous towns and families working the land with calm confidence. It was a vision utterly at odds with everything they had been told. One young prisoner, Klaus Bernhard, later recalled that he kept asking himself, "Where are the ruins? Where are the starving citizens?" All he saw was abundance. Every field bursting with crops, every farmhouse with a well-kept yard, sent a subtle but devastating message. America was not only surviving the war, it was thriving. For German soldiers who had grown up under food rationing, strict class hierarchies, and shortages, the sight of American children playing in front of homes that looked untouched by conflict was deeply unsettling. How could a country fighting on multiple continents still maintain such normalcy at home? To many POWs, this train ride across fertile states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa felt more like an exhibit of American strength than a transport to captivity. The contrast became even sharper as the trains passed through small towns. At rural depots, Americans gathered to catch a glimpse of the enemy rolling through their neighborhoods. Housewives with baskets of groceries, farmers with dusty boots, children waving American flags. These weren't the weak, decadent civilians that Nazi propaganda had described. They looked healthy, confident, and, perhaps most shocking, utterly unafraid. Prisoners expected jeers, thrown stones, maybe even violence. Instead, many townsfolk simply stared with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. To be dismissed rather than feared was its own kind of humiliation, and it forced the Germans to question whether they had truly been the terrifying force they believed themselves to be. Inside the trains, whispered conversations revealed the unease spreading among the men. Some were astonished by the sheer size of American farms, far larger than anything back in Europe, yet seemingly operated by families rather than forced collectives. Others were struck by the apparent equality between civilians. Farmers worked alongside hired hands, shopkeepers mingled freely with customers, and no rigid class distinctions seemed to separate them. What Germans saw rolling by their windows was a society that lived with less visible hierarchy, and that realization quietly gnawed at their own assumptions about order, discipline, and strength. Then there was the abundance of infrastructure. Roads stretched across the horizon, towns were neatly connected by railways, and even the smallest villages had schools, churches, and bustling stores. For men who had witnessed Germany's growing shortages, this level of development was bewildering. How could a society supposedly built on decadence have outproduced one organized around military efficiency? The trains had become classrooms of contradiction, every passing farmstead a lesson that their leaders had lied. These weren't isolated anomalies, they were patterns, mile after mile, state after state. By the time the trains slowed into the outskirts of their designated camps, many prisoners were silent, lost in thought. They had not yet tasted the hamburgers that would become legendary in their memories, nor met the women who would challenge their views of gender roles. But even before stepping into the barracks, their first glimpse of America had already begun dismantling the ideological walls built inside their minds. The land they had been taught to despise looked vibrant, orderly, and rich with opportunity. It was a revelation as powerful as any battlefield defeat, and it marked only the beginning of their unexpected education in captivity. When the German prisoners finally arrived at their destinations, what they encountered defied nearly every expectation. Instead of bleak compounds or barbed wire cages, many camps were cleanly built, orderly, and, by wartime standards, surprisingly humane. Barracks were heated in winter, bunks were neatly arranged, and latrines were functional. The Geneva Convention was not just an abstract treaty here. It shaped daily life. The camps were regularly inspected by the Red Cross, and the Americans made sure their treatment of prisoners would stand as a contrast to the horror stories emerging from Europe. For men braced for brutality, the sheer normalcy of the facilities was disarming. The organization of camp life reflected a deliberate balance. Discipline was strict, but cruelty was rare. Guards maintained authority, yet they did so without the casual violence that many Germans had seen in their own military or feared from their enemies. Orders were barked, but not laced with humiliation. Prisoners quickly noticed that infractions were handled by set rules, not arbitrary whims. It was the beginning of a lesson they would encounter again and again in America. The rule of law mattered more than the whims of individual power. For men raised in a society obsessed with hierarchy, this consistency was a revelation. Perhaps the most shocking sight, however, was the presence of women. Nurses, administrators, secretaries, even some guards were female, giving instructions to soldiers who had been taught that women belonged only in the kitchen, the church, or the nursery. To see women working confidently in roles of authority struck at the heart of Nazi ideology, which relegated them to domestic life. Lieutenant Volker Hoffmann, one prisoner, later wrote that his first interaction with an American nurse left him stunned. She issued orders to guards and prisoners alike, and her authority was unquestioned. For men indoctrinated to believe female leadership was unnatural, this single moment was more unsettling than any guard's weapon. Daily routines in the camps further chipped away at the propaganda the Germans had internalized. There were recreation fields for soccer and volleyball, small libraries with books available in both German and English, and even spaces for religious services. Prisoners could attend classes, join musical groups, or simply spend hours in debate. While still captives, they were given freedoms of choice and expression that contrasted sharply with the rigid controls of Nazi Germany. To their amazement, these privileges were not granted as propaganda tools, but as practical policies rooted in the belief that treating prisoners with dignity reduced unrest. Interaction with local communities added another layer to this cultural shock. Many camps organized work details where prisoners were sent to nearby farms, factories, or public works projects. Under watchful supervision, they labored side by side with American civilians, exchanging brief conversations despite language barriers. What startled the Germans was how ordinary Americans behaved toward them. Farmers thanked them for their labor, shopkeepers handed them goods, and in some cases families offered small gestures of kindness. These were not the decadent, hate-filled enemies described by Nazi propaganda. They were neighbors, co-workers, even equals in shared labor. By the end of their first weeks in captivity, many German prisoners realized that their enemy was not the caricature they had been raised to despise. Instead of crumbling under the weight of war, America appeared strong, confident, and generous, even toward its foes. The sight of women in uniform, the fairness of camp rules, and the decency of ordinary people all combined to deliver a quiet but devastating blow to Nazi ideology. Life inside the camps had only just begun, but already it was clear. Captivity in America would not just be about survival, it would become a confrontation with ideas powerful enough to reshape their futures. If there was one experience that left the deepest impression on German prisoners in America, it was food. For men who had endured months of dwindling rations in North Africa, black bread mixed with sawdust, thin turnip soup, ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, the first meals in American camps felt almost unreal. Thick slices of white bread, real butter, fresh vegetables, and steaming plates of meat appeared in front of them as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. For the prisoners, it was nothing short of a feast. Many admitted later that their first hamburger, ground beef grilled and served on a bun with fresh toppings, was a revelation. Simple, hearty, and consistent, it symbolized everything they had been told America lacked: prosperity, abundance, and quality. What shocked the Germans most was that this wasn't a special performance for propaganda's sake. Day after day, the food remained plentiful. Breakfasts came with eggs, bacon, or cereal. Dinners often included meat, potatoes, vegetables, and dessert. Even coffee, real coffee, was served regularly, a luxury that had disappeared in Germany years before. In letters home, prisoners sometimes wrote, half in awe, half in disbelief, "We eat better as captives here than as free men back home." For many, the discovery cut deep. If the United States could feed its enemies so well in the middle of a global war, what did that say about Nazi claims of American weakness? Meals became a constant subject of conversation inside the camps. Men compared the menus to the scarcity their families faced under Allied bombing and strict rationing back in Germany. They whispered about the irony of it all. Their loved ones in the Reich surviving on watery cabbage soup, while they, captives thousands of miles away, enjoyed fresh fruit and real wheat bread. Food, in this way, became not just nourishment, but a symbol of contradiction, forcing them to reevaluate what they thought they knew about the war. Propaganda had painted America as corrupt and collapsing, but the meals in front of them told another story: a nation overflowing with resources and confidence. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound. Some prisoners felt shame, others gratitude, and a few even resentment, believing it unfair that enemy soldiers dined better than their own families. Yet no one could ignore the truth. Food was power, and America wielded it with ease. The hamburgers, in particular, became almost legendary among the POWs. They represented something beyond taste. A society that could casually offer its prisoners what many Germans considered luxury. To eat one was to confront the uncomfortable reality that their homeland's promises of superiority had been hollow. Food also became a subtle form of education. Sitting in mess halls, prisoners witnessed how Americans organized meals with efficiency, fairness, and equality. Officers and enlisted men were often served similar portions, a contrast to Germany's rigid military hierarchy. The message was clear without being spoken. In America, even the smallest privileges reflected a broader culture of democracy and fairness. The POWs might not have fully understood it at the time, but every meal was teaching them something about the society holding them captive. By the end of their first months in America, many prisoners admitted privately that the abundance of food had changed their perception of the war. If their enemy could feed them like this, fight a global conflict, and still maintain prosperity at home, perhaps Germany's chances of victory were far slimmer than they had imagined. The taste of abundance, symbolized in something as humble as a hamburger, wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It was about exposing a lie. In every bite, they consumed not just bread and meat, but a living demonstration of America's strength, resilience, and confidence in its future. For German prisoners in America, captivity was not limited to barbed wire and barracks. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be required to work, and the United States seized the opportunity. With millions of American farmers drafted into the armed forces, the nation faced severe labor shortages in its fields. The solution? Put POWs to work harvesting crops, tending livestock, and maintaining the farms that fed both the home front and the war effort. It was an arrangement born of necessity, but for the Germans, it became another startling lesson about their captors. Marching out in guarded work details, the men expected grueling punishment labor. Instead, they found themselves on family farms, working under the sun beside civilians who treated them not with cruelty, but with surprising fairness. The image was disorienting. A farmer in overalls handing water to men who, just months earlier, had aimed rifles at his countrymen. Otto Richter, a former artillery sergeant, later wrote that his Nebraska farm host not only thanked the prisoners for their help, but even shared stories about his son fighting in the Pacific. It was a moment of humanity that contradicted every image of Americans as cold and merciless enemies. The work itself was hard but dignified. Prisoners plowed fields, stacked hay, harvested corn, and repaired fences. They were paid small wages, tokens compared to a soldier's salary, but real money nonetheless, which they could spend on small luxuries at camp canteens. This simple act of being compensated carried weight. It reinforced the idea that labor had value, even for enemies. Unlike the forced labor systems of Nazi Germany, where hierarchy and brutality defined the experience, American farm work emphasized productivity and fairness. For many POWs, it was their first time realizing that work could be both demanding and respected. Even more eye-opening were the relationships forged, however cautious, between POWs and local families. Despite official restrictions on fraternization, conversations inevitably happened through gestures, broken English, or halting German. Farmers asked about life in Germany, while prisoners marveled at the casual friendliness of their captors. They noticed how farm owners worked alongside their employees, a stark contrast to Germany's rigid class divisions. The egalitarian spirit of American society, where even successful landowners rolled up their sleeves and labored beside others, was quietly teaching the Germans a new way of looking at work and dignity. Not every experience was idyllic. There were tensions, escape attempts, and occasionally hostility from civilians who had lost family members in the war. Yet overall, the system functioned with remarkable success. The Germans produced food that sustained American soldiers abroad, while Americans, in turn, treated their labor with fairness. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They were feeding the very nation they had fought to defeat. But instead of deepening resentment, this irony often fostered reluctant admiration. How strong must a country be, they wondered, to entrust its food supply in part to its enemies? By the end of harvest seasons, many German POWs admitted privately that these work details had softened them more than any lecture or propaganda leaflet. They had seen Americans up close, not as faceless enemies, but as people who valued labor, respected even their foes, and lived without rigid class boundaries. The experience of working the land left an imprint that lasted long after their return to Germany. For some, it became the seed of a belief that democracy and dignity could coexist, and that strength was not just about conquest, but about fairness in the smallest acts of daily life. Inside the camps, beyond the fields and the mess halls, another transformation quietly unfolded, one that struck at the very heart of Nazi ideology. For the first time in their adult lives, many German soldiers encountered the notion of free thought. Education programs sprang up across camps, with classes in English, history, mathematics, and even philosophy. At first, these lessons seemed like little more than distractions from boredom. But soon, prisoners realized that American-style education was different. It encouraged questions, debates, and the open exchange of ideas. Instead of rigid lectures demanding memorization, instructors often asked, "What do you think?" For men raised in a system where obedience was prized above curiosity, this was revolutionary. The camp libraries became unlikely sanctuaries of discovery. Stocked with both German and American books, newspapers, and magazines, they opened windows into a world of uncensored thought. German POWs leafed through American papers and were stunned to see criticisms of government policies, open debates about strategy, and even cartoons mocking politicians. The idea that a country at war could allow dissent, printed in black and white for anyone to read, was almost incomprehensible. In Nazi Germany, such freedom would have been unthinkable. Here, it was treated as an ordinary right, and that contrast planted seeds of doubt in the minds of many. Religion, too, offered unexpected lessons. Chaplains, both military and civilian, visited the camps to lead services, provide pastoral care, and speak openly about forgiveness, redemption, and moral responsibility. For prisoners accustomed to seeing religion twisted to serve Nazi propaganda, this approach was startling. In America, faith was not a political weapon, but a personal compass. Sermons about dignity and forgiveness resonated deeply with men wrestling with guilt, defeat, and the loss of purpose. One chaplain later recalled, "They weren't searching for our ideas. They were searching for meaning." For many Germans, faith became a bridge to self-reflection, and in some cases to rejecting the ideology that had brought them there. Prisoners also began producing their own culture. Many camps allowed them to publish newsletters, stage theater productions, or form orchestras. These activities gave them a sense of agency, but more importantly, they encouraged creative expression that had long been constrained under Nazi control. At Concordia, Kansas, the prisoner orchestra gained fame for playing both German classics and American anthems. To hear fellow Germans perform the Star-Spangled Banner was bewildering, even moving, for both captors and captives. It symbolized how art and music could humanize the enemy in ways no speech or policy ever could. Conversations among the prisoners often revealed just how much their worldviews were shifting. Some clung stubbornly to old beliefs, convinced that defeat was only temporary, but others admitted openly that their assumptions were cracking. How could they reconcile the reality they were living, abundance, fairness, dignity, with the propaganda they had grown up with? The more they read, learned, and debated, the harder it became to deny that they had been misled. For many, this was the most unsettling experience of captivity. Not hunger or punishment, but the realization that the very foundations of their worldview were dissolving. By late 1944, American officials began to recognize what was happening. They called it the Great Awakening, a slow but profound shift in how German prisoners saw the world. Through books, debates, and even small freedoms of choice inside the camps, these men were being exposed to democracy not as an abstract theory, but as a lived reality. They were beginning to grasp that freedom of thought was not a weakness, as Nazi leaders had claimed, but a source of resilience. And in that realization lay the first stirrings of change that would echo far beyond the fences of their captivity. By the summer of 1944, the tone inside America's prisoner of war camps began to shift. The news of D-Day crackled through radios and camp newspapers, announcing that Allied troops had stormed the beaches of Normandy. For many German prisoners, it was the moment their illusions collapsed. The Reich was not invincible. The war was turning decisively against them. Yet even more powerful than the battlefield updates was what soon followed, the revelation of the concentration camps. As Allied armies liberated sites like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, American authorities made a deliberate choice to confront German POWs with the evidence. Films, photographs, and testimonies were shown to them, not as propaganda, but as undeniable proof of crimes committed in their name. The screenings left men stunned into silence. In crowded halls, hundreds of prisoners sat rigid, eyes fixed on images they could barely process. Emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, the machinery of industrialized murder. Many wept openly, Others hung their heads in shame, while some refused to believe what they were seeing. For those who had dismissed rumors of atrocities as Allied lies, the impact was devastating. Lieutenant Volker Hoffman later wrote in his diary that the silence in the room was deafening, as if the air itself had been ripped away. It was not just Germany's defeat they were witnessing. It was the moral collapse of the very ideology they had served. What made the experience even more unsettling was the way Americans handled it. Guards did not gloat or mock. Instead, chaplains and educators invited discussion groups, offering prisoners the chance to voice their disbelief, grief, and anger. The message was clear. This was not about breaking their spirits, but about forcing a confrontation with truth. For many POWs, this humane approach deepened the shock. They expected punishment, perhaps vengeance. Instead, they were offered space to grapple with guilt and responsibility. It revealed something profound about American society, that even in victory, it sought not simply to condemn, but to reform. The psychological effect was enormous. Some prisoners clung desperately to denial, insisting the films were staged or exaggerated. But for many others, the images tore away the last shreds of faith in Nazi propaganda. They began asking questions they had never dared to voice. What did I serve? What did I believe? How blind was I? For young men indoctrinated since childhood, it was as if the floor beneath them had vanished. The ideology that had promised them meaning and superiority now stood exposed as a machine of death. Facing that truth was perhaps the most painful captivity of all. Re-education programs seized this moment. American professors, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany, guided prisoners through classes on democracy, history, and ethics. Instead of lecturing, they challenged POWs to think critically, to question assumptions, and to rebuild their moral frameworks. One former tank commander recalled being asked what he believed about justice, only to realize he had never truly thought about it beyond what he had been told. For men who had lived under authoritarian obedience, the chance to wrestle with questions of conscience was both disorienting and liberating. By early 1945, the moral reckoning had become the defining feature of life in many camps. Captivity was no longer just physical, it was psychological, even spiritual. German soldiers who had expected punishment instead found themselves confronted with the hardest truth: that their greatest battle was not with the Americans, but with their own past. And as they faced that truth, many began to change, not through force, but through the undeniable weight of reality and the unexpected decency of their captors. As the war drew closer to its end, American authorities expanded what became known as the re-education programs. These were not crude indoctrination efforts, but carefully designed lessons intended to plant democratic values in minds that had been shaped by authoritarianism. Classrooms sprouted inside the camps, staffed by professors and clergy who believed in persuasion through ideas, not intimidation. Prisoners were introduced to concepts like individual rights, freedom of the press, and the separation of powers. Instead of being told what to believe, they were encouraged to debate and question, a startling departure from the rigid top-down education many had experienced in Nazi Germany. For the first time, they discovered that disagreement was not a threat, but a strength. One of the most striking lessons came not from books, but from daily camp governance. Prisoners were allowed to elect representatives to handle disputes, organize cultural activities, and even help plan meals. These committees gave men a taste of self-government. Mistakes were made, arguments erupted, decisions were contested, but the very process of voting, negotiating, and compromising was transformative. To men raised in a society where obedience was demanded and authority unquestioned, this small taste of democracy was eye-opening. They saw firsthand that leadership could be earned, not inherited, and that collective voices carried weight. The influence of American women continued to challenge German assumptions. By 1945, women were running offices, teaching classes, and even commanding certain camp operations. Colonel Mary Halloran, one of the first female officers to oversee POW administration, became a symbol of this shift. For German officers who once sneered at the idea of female authority, her competence and respect shattered stereotypes. Prisoners who had believed strength could only come from men now saw evidence to the contrary every day. Slowly, grudgingly, many began to admit that gender roles were not fixed truths, but cultural constructs, and that America's openness to women's participation was a mark of resilience, not weakness. The fairness of American justice also left a deep impression. When disputes or accusations arose, even prisoners were entitled to hearings, defense representation, and appeals. Otto Kellner, a former SS officer, experienced this when he was falsely accused of striking a guard. Expecting swift punishment, he instead received a proper trial, where evidence proved his innocence. For a man who had served under a regime where guilt was assumed and punishment was often arbitrary, the experience was transformative. He later admitted, "They followed their rules, even when it would have been easier not to. That taught me more about justice than years of Nazi lectures." Economic abundance reinforced the lessons of democracy. Prisoners marveled at the Sears catalogs passed around by guards, filled with appliances, clothing, and luxuries available to ordinary families. To them, it seemed miraculous, a society where prosperity was accessible not just to elites, but to working people. This vision of social mobility, farmers' sons becoming successful businessmen, immigrants rising through hard work, stood in stark contrast to Germany's obsession with bloodlines and rigid hierarchy. America's democratic promise, they realized, was not just political, but economic, the belief that effort could overcome origin. By the final months of captivity, many German POWs had undergone subtle but profound changes. Not all embraced democracy, and some remained bitter, clinging to the ideology of their youth. But for thousands, the seeds had been planted. They had witnessed a society that, even in wartime, valued fairness, equality, and debate. They had experienced the dignity of labor, the shock of female authority, the fairness of law, and the abundance of opportunity. These seeds of democracy would not sprout immediately, but they would take root. And when the men returned home to a shattered Germany, those lessons would quietly begin to shape the future of their country. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, life inside the American camps entered a strange limbo. The prisoners felt a mixture of relief and dread, relief that the war was over, dread for what awaited them back in Germany. Their homeland lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, and the Reich that had promised them glory utterly destroyed. Yet as repatriation orders trickled in, many men carried with them something far more enduring than scars of defeat: the lessons they had absorbed in captivity. America had not only housed them, it had reshaped them. The journey home was surreal. Boarding ships once more, the Germans looked back on a country that had treated them with a mixture of firmness and humanity. Some carried small souvenirs, English books, photographs with American farmers, or even recipes scribbled on scraps of paper. Many took with them a taste for hamburgers, joking that they had eaten like kings as prisoners. But behind the humor was something deeper, an appreciation of abundance, fairness, and dignity that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian system they had served. They were going back as defeated soldiers, but also as witnesses to another way of life. Back in Germany, the contrast was stark. Streets were filled with rubble, food was scarce, and despair hung in the air. Families struggled to survive in a landscape scarred by bombings and occupation. For returning POWs, the memory of American farms, well-stocked canteens, and open debates seemed like a dream. Yet these memories became guiding lights. Some former prisoners began working as teachers, journalists, or local officials, quietly applying the lessons of democracy they had learned in the camps. Others used their English skills and understanding of American culture to build bridges in trade and diplomacy. They had gone to America as enemies, but returned as unlikely ambassadors. Not everyone embraced this transformation. Some remained bitter, dismissing their experiences as anomalies or clinging to resentment. But studies years later confirmed a striking pattern. Those who had spent time in American camps were significantly more supportive of democratic institutions than those who had been held elsewhere. The seeds planted in mess halls, classrooms, and farm fields took root in post-war Germany, shaping a generation that would help rebuild the nation not as another authoritarian state, but as a stable democracy aligned with the West. Captivity had, in a paradoxical sense, become liberation. The symbols of that transformation remained simple, yet profound. Women in positions of authority, once mocked as unnatural by Nazi doctrine, became role models for new opportunities in post-war society. The hamburgers and plentiful meals were remembered not just as comforts, but as proof of a system that could provide for its people even in war. The rule of law, fairness in work, and freedom of thought all left marks that could not easily be erased. For Hans Müller, a young soldier who had first peered anxiously out of a train window in Kansas, the experience inspired him to become a journalist, chronicling the reconstruction of Germany with a new belief in the value of truth and accountability. By 1946, as the last prisoners left American shores, many carried with them more than possessions. They carried stories. Stories of guards who treated them with respect, of farmers who offered them water in the fields, of chaplains who spoke of forgiveness, of hamburgers that tasted like freedom itself. These stories circulated quietly through post-war Germany, becoming threads in the fabric of a new national identity. In the end, the great irony was unmistakable. In losing the war, these men discovered democracy. And in the quiet dignity of their captivity, they found the first outlines of the Germany that would rise again, not through conquest, but through freedom.